They thought the farmhouse had been empty for years, just another tired place the world had forgotten. So they stayed. Slowly, they brought it back to life, board by board, seed by seed. Seasons passed, quiet and careful, almost kind. Then one cold morning, as frost clung to the fields, a truck rolled slowly up the gravel road. I was behind the wheel with nowhere left to run, and everything waiting for me at that door. Late autumn settled quietly over northern Montana, the kind of season where the air carried both endings and the faint promise of something stubborn enough to survive them. Cold wind brushing across wide-open fields the color of old wheat, a sky stretched pale and distant like it had forgotten how to feel. I hadn't planned to come back, not now, not ever if I could help it. But plans have a way of collapsing when the past finally grows tired of waiting, and mine had sent its last warning in the form of a thin envelope with my name written in a handwriting that wasn't personal, wasn't angry, just final. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 52 years old, and for the last decade I've been very good at not belonging anywhere. Before that, I was a Navy SEAL, the kind of man people describe as steady, controlled, built for chaos but uncomfortable with quiet. Though the truth is quieter than that, I learned to function in places where fear didn't get a vote. And when I came back, the world expected me to slide back into normal life like nothing had changed. But something had. Something permanent and invisible. The kind of shift that doesn't heal, just settles into you like winter into bone. My wife, Claire, used to say I carried silence like a second skin. She had soft brown hair that always fell across her cheek no matter how many times she brushed it away. Warm eyes that made you feel seen in a way that was almost uncomfortable if you weren't used to kindness, and a patience that I never quite understood until it was gone. She died in a car accident while I was overseas, and by the time I came back, there was nothing left to hold except a house full of echoes and a life that didn't recognize me anymore. So I left. Not in a dramatic way. No slammed doors or final words. Just distance. 1 mile at a time until the world blurred into highways and gas stations and nights spent in the back of my truck. That truck is still with me, older now. Paint worn thin, engine steady in a way I trust more than people. And beside me sits Duke, a 7-year-old German shepherd, with a thick sable coat that catches the light in shades of black and brown, eyes sharp and observant. The kind of dog that doesn't waste energy on unnecessary movement. He came into my life after the service, trained but not rigid, loyal without being needy. He doesn't bark unless there's a reason, and even then it's more of a statement than a reaction. People say dogs reflect their owners. If that's true, then Duke is everything I try to be. Calm, aware, present, without demanding anything in return. The road leading back to the farmhouse felt longer than I remembered. Gravel crunching under the tires like it was reminding me of every mile I had chosen to stay away. I didn't rush, didn't slow down either. Just let the moment come the way it wanted to. And when the property line finally appeared, something inside my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not pain exactly, more like recognition wrapped in resistance. I had prepared myself for decay, for broken windows and collapsed wood, for weeds swallowing everything whole. It would have been easier that way, easier to confirm that leaving had been justified, that nothing worth returning to had survived my absence, but what I saw instead forced me to sit there for a moment longer than necessary. Engine idling, hands resting on the wheel like I needed permission to move. The fence was standing, not perfect, but repaired in places with wood that didn't match. The porch steps were clear enough to walk on, and there was smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, steady line that had no business being there. Someone had been here, not just passing through, but staying, working, caring in a way that didn't align with abandonment. Duke shifted slightly in his seat, not tense, not alert, just aware. His ears angled forward as he studied the house with a quiet focus that told me more than any bark could have. "Yeah," I muttered under my breath, more to myself than to him. "I see it too." I stepped out of the truck, boots pressing into the gravel, the sound louder than it should have been in the stillness of the morning. And for a second, I just stood there, taking it in, the way the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something green beneath the cold, the way the door looked like it had been opened recently, not warped shut like I remembered. Every instinct I had sharpened over years kicked in, not from fear, but from habit, scanning, assessing, measuring the unknown. But underneath that there was something else, something less defined, something that felt dangerously close to curiosity. I moved toward the porch, Duke falling into step beside me, close but not crowding, his presence steady and grounding in a way I had come to rely on without admitting it. The door opened before I could knock. They stood there like they had been expecting someone, just not me. The man was in his late 70s, tall once but now slightly bent with age, shoulders still broad under a worn flannel jacket, gray hair thin but combed back, face lined deeply in a way that spoke more of endurance than defeat. His name, I would later learn, was Harold Whitaker, a man who had spent most of his life working land that never promised anything but hard returns, the kind of person who didn't waste words because he had learned early that effort mattered more than explanations. Beside him stood a woman a few years younger, Margaret Whitaker, slender but not fragile, her posture careful like she was always aware of her own limits, silver hair tied loosely at the back, pale skin touched with the kind of softness that comes from years of quiet resilience. Her eyes were the first thing I noticed, not weak, not fearful, just tired in a way that didn't ask for sympathy. She looked at me like she was trying to understand what I meant before I even spoke. They didn't look like intruders, and that was the problem. They looked like they belonged. The silence stretched just long enough to become something else, something that needed to be broken, and I felt it settle in my chest, that old familiar weight of having to define a moment before it defined me. I reached into my jacket slowly, not because I was worried about them, but because I could see the slight shift in Harold's stance, the way his attention sharpened just enough to signal caution. I pulled out the folded documents, edges worn from being handled more than I wanted to admit, and held them up where they could see. "This is my home," I said, my voice steady, controlled, carrying more certainty than I actually felt. The words landed between us, not loud, not aggressive, just present, like something that had been waiting its turn. Margaret's expression changed first, not fear exactly, but something softer slipping into place, like a realization she hadn't prepared for. Harold didn't move right away. His eyes stayed on mine, measuring, not challenging, just confirming something in his own mind before he responded. And in that moment, standing there with the wind moving quietly through the fields and Duke silent at my side, I realized something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not even ownership, but hesitation. Because for the first time since I had turned back onto this road, I wasn't sure if I was claiming this place to take it back, or just trying to prove that I still had something left to claim. The wind had quieted by the time I lowered my hand, the papers still between my fingers like something that belonged to a different version of me, one that understood ownership in simpler terms, lines on a map, names on a document, things you could prove without having to feel them. Harold stepped aside first, not as an invitation exactly, more like an acknowledgement that whatever this moment was, it wasn't going to be solved on the porch. Margaret didn't speak, but her eyes moved briefly to Duke, then back to me, as if measuring not just who I was, but what I might carry with me into their fragile balance. I didn't rush forward. I let the silence stretch a second longer, long enough to hear the faint creak of the house settling in the cold, long enough to notice the way Margaret's hand pressed lightly against her chest before dropping again like it hadn't meant anything. "We didn't know anyone was coming back," Harold said finally, his voice rough but steady, shaped by years of speaking only when necessary. "Thought it was done. Left behind." He didn't apologize. That was the first thing I noticed. Not arrogance, not defiance, just a quiet certainty that survival didn't come with room for guilt. I nodded once, more to move the moment forward than to agree. "You've been here long?" I asked. "5 winters," Margaret answered before Harold could, her voice softer but not weak, the kind of tone that carried warmth even when the words themselves didn't offer any comfort. Up close, I could see more of her now, the faint bluish tint under her eyes, the way her breath came just a fraction shorter than it should, subtle enough that most people would miss it, but not me, not after years of reading bodies before they could betray themselves. She noticed me noticing, and something like a smile flickered across her lips, quick and practiced, the kind meant to close a door without making it obvious. Duke shifted beside me, stepping just slightly closer to her, not protective, not defensive, just present, and for a moment her hand hovered near his head before pulling back like she wasn't sure she had the right. I stepped forward then, crossing the threshold into a place that had once belonged to my life in a way that no longer felt entirely true. The air inside was different from what I remembered, not stale, not empty, but lived in, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, something baking, something growing. The floorboards didn't groan under neglect. They responded, solid, repaired, the kind of work done by hands that didn't have much but gave what they could. I moved slowly, taking it in piece by piece, the patched sections of wall where new wood met old, the table near the window with a simple jar of dried flowers, not decorative, just there, like a quiet refusal to let the place feel abandoned. "We fixed what we could," Harold said, stepping in behind me, his boots lighter on the floor than I expected for a man his size. Didn't have much, but enough to make it hold. I ran a hand along the back of a chair, the wood smooth from use, not neglect. "You didn't just make it hold," I said before I could stop myself. "You brought it back." The words surprised me, not because they weren't true, but because I hadn't planned to admit it out loud. Harold didn't respond right away, but I saw something shift in his posture. Not pride, not relief. Something quieter, like recognition. Margaret moved toward the stove, lifting the lid slightly to check whatever was simmering inside, the motion slow, careful. And there it was again, that small pause in her breathing, the almost imperceptible tightening in her shoulders before she straightened. "You've been on the road," she said without turning, her tone more observation than question. "Long time." I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have. "Long enough," I answered. That seemed to be enough for her. She didn't press, didn't ask where or why, and I found myself unexpectedly grateful for that. Outside, a faint sound carried through the walls, the distant rumble of an engine passing somewhere far off, and for a second, all 3 of us went still. Not out of fear exactly, but out of habit. The kind that comes from learning that quiet moments don't always stay that way. It passed quickly, leaving behind the same stillness, but something in the room had shifted again, a subtle tightening that didn't quite belong to the conversation we were having. "You got people come through here?" I asked, my voice low. Harold's jaw moved slightly before he answered. "Sometimes," he said. "Not for us. For the land." That was enough to tell me what I needed to know. Places like this didn't stay unnoticed forever, not when they still had value to someone looking to take it. Margaret set a bowl on the table, then another, moving with a rhythm that spoke of routine. of days repeating not out of boredom, but necessity. "You should eat," she said, finally turning to face me fully. "Travel like that, it takes more than it gives." I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because something about accepting that offer felt like crossing a line I hadn't defined yet. Duke made the decision for me. He moved past my leg, walked to the edge of the table, and sat, calm, patient, like he had already decided this was where we were staying for now. I shook my head slightly, a faint exhale escaping before I pulled out the chair and sat down across from them. We ate without ceremony, the food simple but real, the kind that fills more than just hunger. Harold spoke in short pieces about the work they had done, the roof that nearly collapsed the first winter, the well that had to be cleared by hand, the garden that took 2 seasons before it gave anything back. Margaret added details here and there, softer, but no less certain, her words weaving the spaces Harold left open. I listened more than I spoke, not because I didn't have questions, but because I was starting to understand something that didn't need explaining. They hadn't taken this place, they had carried it. And somewhere in the middle of that realization a thought settled into me that I didn't want to examine too closely. I had left this house to disappear. They had stayed to make sure it didn't. When the meal ended, I stood, slower than I intended, my eyes moving once more around the room, seeing it now not as something that had been taken from me, but as something that had been kept alive in my absence. That was the part that stayed with me as I moved toward the door, not anger, not even confusion, but something sharper, something that cut closer to truth than I was ready to admit. I paused at the threshold, my hand resting briefly against the frame, feeling the solidness of it, the quiet evidence of time and effort layered into every inch. It should have felt like reclaiming something. Instead, it felt like stepping into a place that had moved on without me. And, for the first time since I had turned back onto this road, I understood what unsettled me the most. It wasn't that they had stayed, it was that they had done it better than I ever had. The light outside had shifted into that soft gray that comes just before evening settles in for good, the kind of quiet hour where sound carries a little farther and thoughts sit a little heavier than they should. And somehow I was still there, sitting at a table that used to belong to a life I no longer recognized, across from 2 people who had filled the space I had left behind without asking permission or making apologies. The room felt smaller than I remembered, not because the walls had moved, but because it no longer echoed. Every surface held something now, a purpose, a memory that wasn't mine, but didn't feel entirely Chijoy either, like the house had decided it didn't care who owned it as long as someone stayed. Margaret moved carefully between the stove and the table, her steps measured, controlled in a way that spoke of someone who had learned to work around limits instead of fighting them, and every now and then there was that same pause in her breathing, quick, almost hidden, followed by a subtle tightening in her jaw like she was swallowing discomfort instead of letting it show. Duke noticed it before I did, or maybe at the same time, but in a way that required no thought. He had settled himself beside her chair, not close enough to be in the way, not far enough to ignore, his body angled slightly toward her like a silent guard posted without being asked. That alone should have meant nothing, except Duke didn't do that. Not for strangers, not for anyone outside the narrow circle he accepted as his own, and I found myself watching him more than I watched the people across from me. Harold spoke in pieces, the way he always did, about the winter storms that nearly took the roof the second year, about how the well had frozen solid, and they had spent 3 days breaking through ice with tools that were never meant for that kind of work, his voice steady, not dramatic, like hardship was just another task to be completed rather than something worth remembering. Margaret filled in the spaces he left behind, softer details, the way they had rationed food, the small victories when the first seedlings took root in soil that had been dead for years. Her words didn't linger. They moved, like she understood that telling too much truth all at once could break something fragile. I ate slowly, not because I was full, but because every bite felt like it carried more weight than it should have, as if accepting this food meant accepting something else I hadn't agreed to yet. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the walls in long, steady breaths, and for a moment, the sound reminded me of nights overseas, the kind where you listen more than you breathe, waiting for something you can't see to reveal itself. But there was nothing like that here. Just a house holding together against the cold. Just people who had decided to stay when leaving would have been easier. The door creaked open without warning, and I was on my feet before I had time to think, chair scraping back just enough to break the rhythm of the room, Duke rising beside me in one smooth motion, not aggressive, just ready. A woman stepped inside, pausing when she saw me, her posture shifting in that quick, instinctive way people do when something unexpected enters their space. She looked to be in her early 40s, tall and lean, with a practical kind of strength, dark auburn hair pulled back into a loose braid, strands escaping around a face marked by sun and time rather than age, her skin weathered but not worn, eyes sharp, observant, the kind that didn't miss much even when she pretended to. Her name, as Margaret introduced her, was Lily Carter. "Ethan," Margaret said gently, as if smoothing the moment before it could harden. "This is Lily. She helps us sometimes." Lily didn't step further in right away, her gaze moving from me to Duke, then back again, measuring, not unfriendly, but not welcoming either, the kind of caution that comes from having learned to read people before trusting them. "Didn't know you were expecting company," she said, her voice even, controlled, carrying just enough edge to make it clear she wasn't entirely comfortable with what she was seeing. "Neither did I," I answered, my tone matching hers more than I intended. Harold let out a short breath, something close to a laugh but not quite, and gestured toward the table. "He's the one who owns the place," he said, like he was stating the weather, nothing more. That shifted something in Lily's expression, not shock, not fear, but a recalibration, like she was adjusting a piece in her mind that didn't fit the picture she had built. "Well," she said after a second, stepping fully inside now, closing the door behind her with a firm push, "guess that makes things a little more complicated." She set a small basket on the table, the scent of fresh herbs rising faintly from it, and moved toward Margaret without hesitation, her attention shifting entirely to the older woman in a way that told me this wasn't a casual visit. "You been taking it easy?" she asked quietly, her hand already reaching for Margaret's wrist, checking her pulse with a familiarity that came from practice, not guesswork. "As much as he lets me," Margaret replied, nodding slightly toward Harold, a hint of humor softening her tone. Lily frowned just enough to show she wasn't convinced, but she didn't push, not yet. I stepped back then, letting the moment unfold without me, my presence suddenly feeling like something that didn't quite belong in the quiet exchange happening in front of me. Duke didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, his eyes tracking Lily's movements for a second before settling back on Margaret, his focus unwavering. That was when it hit me. Not all at once, but in pieces that settled into place with an uncomfortable clarity. He wasn't guarding the house. He wasn't even guarding me. He was watching her, watching Margaret. I leaned against the edge of the table, crossing my arms without realizing it, my gaze shifting between them, between the easy familiarity of Lily's presence and the quiet resilience of Harold and Margaret, and for the first time since I had stepped onto this property, I felt like I was the one out of place. Not them, not the people who had stayed and built something out of nothing. Me, the man who had left it all behind and come back expecting it to wait exactly as he had abandoned it. The conversation drifted back into something softer after that. Lily taking a seat, adding her own pieces to the story, Small things about the town, about people who passed through, about how not everyone who came looking at land had honest intentions. Her words careful, but not vague, enough to confirm what I had already suspected, that this place wasn't as invisible as it once had been. I listened, not interrupting, not inserting myself into something that didn't need my voice. And somewhere in that quiet observation, another realization settled in, heavier than the last. Duke had chosen his place in this room without hesitation. He had decided, without asking me, who mattered here. And he was right. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing just a fraction, and let the truth land where it needed to. Duke trusted them. And for the first time, I had to admit, he might have gotten there before I did. Morning came without ceremony, pale light spreading slowly across the fields like it had nowhere else to be, and I found myself awake before I could remember deciding to sleep, sitting on the edge of a chair that didn't belong to me in a house that felt less like a memory and more like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The air inside carried the faint warmth of a fire that had been kept alive through the night, not out of comfort but necessity, and somewhere beyond the walls, I could hear the quiet, steady movements of a people who had learned to build their lives around small, deliberate actions instead of grand plans. Duke was already up, standing near the doorway, his posture relaxed but attentive, ears angled toward the sound of Margaret moving slowly across the kitchen, her footsteps careful, each one measured as if she was negotiating with her own body rather than trusting it to carry her without thought. I watched her for a moment longer than I intended, the slight hitch in her breathing more noticeable now in the stillness of the morning. The way she paused briefly before reaching for the kettle, not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm what I had already suspected. She caught me looking, of course she did, and there was that same small, practiced smile again, the kind that asked you not to ask questions you already knew the answer to. "You don't sleep much," she said, her voice softer in the morning, like it hadn't fully decided to wake up yet. "Not when I don't have to," I replied, pushing myself to my feet, the stiffness in my joints a reminder that time had been moving whether I acknowledged it or not. Harold stepped in from outside, bringing with him a trace of cold air and the scent of damp earth, his coat dusted lightly with frost, his face set in that same steady expression that didn't change much no matter what the day brought. "Fence held," he said simply, setting down a pair of worn gloves near the door. "For now." It was a small statement, but it carried more weight than it should have because in places like this, "for now" was often the difference between staying and losing everything. I leaned against the table, arms crossed, letting the moment settle before I spoke, because once I did, there was no taking it back, no pretending this was just another stop along the road. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet more sharply than I intended. Harold didn't look surprised. Margaret didn't look away. Duke shifted slightly, moving closer to my side, not because he sensed danger, but because he sensed change. "This place," I continued, holding their attention in a way that felt heavier with each word. "It's not just about who's living here. The county's been sending notices for years. Taxes, fees, things I didn't deal with." I paused, not for effect, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way I hadn't allowed before. "I've got 30 days, I said finally. 30 days to settle it, or they take the land, everything on it." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled into the room like something that had been waiting its turn. Margaret's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the counter, not enough to show fear, but enough to reveal the weight of what she understood immediately. Harold's jaw shifted, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before returning to me, steady as ever. 30 days, he repeated, not questioning, just confirming. I nodded once. "That's it," For a moment, no one spoke. And in that silence, I could hear the wind again, brushing against the house like it was testing its strength, like it was asking how much more it could take before something gave. The door opened again without knocking, and this time, I didn't move, didn't react the way I had the night before, because I already knew who it would be. Lily stepped inside, her presence bringing with it a kind of grounded energy that didn't belong to the land, but fit into it anyway. Her braid slightly loosened, strands of hair catching the light, her coat worn but clean, practical in a way that spoke of someone who chose function over appearance without sacrificing either. She took one look at the room and stopped just short of the table, her eyes moving from Margaret to Harold, then finally to me. "Something happened," she said. Not a question, just an observation sharpened by instinct. "He told us," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a calm that felt more deliberate now, "about the land." Lily's expression didn't change immediately, but I saw the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders squared just slightly, like she was stepping into a role she had taken on more than once before. "How long?" she asked. 30 days, Harold answered this time. Lily let out a breath, slow and controlled, her gaze dropping to the table for a second before lifting again, clearer now, focused. "Then we don't have time to think about what we can't do," she said, stepping closer, her voice steady in a way that cut through the uncertainty. "We focus on what we can." I watched her as she spoke, the way she moved naturally into the space between problem and action, not asking permission, not waiting for agreement, just building a path forward because standing still wasn't an option she recognized. "There's a market in town," she continued, her eyes flicking briefly toward Margaret. "Small but steady. People come for produce, homemade goods, things that feel real." She looked at Harold. "You've got the land, you've got the skill," then at Margaret. "And you've got hands that know how to make something people will come back for." Finally, her gaze settled on me. "And you," she said, her tone shifting just enough to acknowledge something she hadn't decided how to define yet. "You've got 30 days and a reason to stay." The words landed differently than anything that had been said so far, not because they solved anything, but because they turned the problem into something that could be worked, shaped, approached instead of avoided. I straightened slightly, uncrossing my arms without realizing it, my mind already moving through possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider until now. It wasn't enough. It might never be enough, but it was something. Margaret lowered herself slowly into a chair, Duke immediately adjusting his position to stay close, his presence as steady as ever, and for the first time since I had arrived, I saw something like hope flicker across her face, fragile, uncertain, but there. Harold nodded once, the decision settling into him without the need for discussion. "We try," he said simply. That was all it took. I looked at them, really looked this time, at the lines in Harold's face carved by years of work and quiet endurance, at Margaret's careful strength, at Lily's unspoken determination, and I felt something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. Something heavier than obligation, more complicated than ownership. "You can stay," I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt. "All of you." I paused, letting the weight of that settle, not just for them, but for myself. "But we do this right, no hiding, no pretending this isn't what it is." Lily nodded first. Harold followed. Margaret didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes was enough. I exhaled slowly, the decision locking into place in a way that left no room for retreat. Because the truth was, I hadn't just given them a place to stay. I had given myself a reason not to leave. And somewhere beneath all of that, I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit when I stepped onto this land. I wasn't just trying to save the house. I was tying myself to it, to them, to something that would not let me walk away again without losing more than I could afford. The afternoon carried a brittle kind of stillness, the sort that settled in just before something shifted beneath it, and I could feel it before I saw it, the same way you learn to read a room before a door opens, the same way instinct speaks in quiet signals long before anything becomes visible. The land stretched out in front of the house, open and honest in a way that left nowhere to hide, and maybe that was why the sound of the engine reached us so clearly, low and deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. I was standing near the fence line when Duke's posture changed, subtle at first, his ears lifting, body aligning toward the road, not tense, but focused in a way that told me this wasn't just another passing truck. "You hear that?" Harold asked from behind me, though his tone said he already knew the answer. I didn't turn right away. I watched the line where the road met the property, the place where dust rose before anything else appeared. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I hear it." The truck came into view slowly, a dark SUV, newer than anything that belonged out here. Its surface too clean, too untouched by the kind of work this land demanded. It didn't stop at the edge. It rolled in like it had done it before, like the path already belonged to it. Duke stepped forward half a pace, not breaking position, just making it clear he was there, his weight balanced, eyes locked on the vehicle with that same calm intensity that had gotten both of us through places far worse than this. The engine cut off, and for a moment, everything went still again, like the world was holding its breath just long enough to see what came next. The door opened with a soft, controlled motion, and the man who stepped out moved like he understood the value of pacing, like he knew exactly how much presence to carry without wasting any of it. Victor Kane was taller than I expected, early 60s maybe, his frame lean but not fragile, the kind of build that suggested he had once done real work before deciding he no longer needed to, his hair silver at the temples but carefully maintained, his jaw clean-shaven, sharp lines that gave his face a polished, almost deliberate look. He wore a long dark coat that didn't belong to this place, boots that had never been tested by mud or frost, and a watch that caught the light just enough to remind you it was there. But it was his eyes that stayed with me. Not cold, not warm, just calculating, the kind that measured value in terms of gain rather than meaning. He smiled as he approached, not wide, not forced, just enough to suggest familiarity where none existed. "Afternoon," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying an ease that didn't quite reach his eyes. Harold stepped up beside me, slower than usual, and I caught it again, that slight tremor in his hand before he slipped it into his coat pocket, the way he shifted his weight just enough to hide it. He thought no one noticed. He was wrong. "Can we help you?" Harold asked, his tone steady, but I could hear the effort behind it. Victor's gaze moved between us, taking in the space, the house, the small signs of life that had no place in his plans. "I was wondering how things were coming along," he said lightly, like he was checking on a project he had already invested in. His eyes flicked toward me, lingering just long enough to mark me as something new. "Didn't expect to see you here." I stepped forward before Harold could answer, placing myself just slightly ahead, not aggressive, not confrontational, just present. "That's because it's my place," I said, my voice even, controlled in a way that didn't invite argument but didn't leave room for misunderstanding either. Victor's smile didn't disappear, but it shifted, just slightly, like a man adjusting his grip on something that wasn't as easy as he had expected. "Ah," he said, drawing the word out just enough to make it sound thoughtful. "So you're the one who's been avoiding the paperwork." There was no accusation in his tone, just a quiet acknowledgement of facts he already understood. Not anymore, I replied. That seemed to interest him more than anything else so far. He took another step closer, his gaze sharpening in a way that stripped away the polite surface he had started with. You know the situation, then, he said. Taxes, liens, deadlines. It's not exactly something you can fix overnight. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit between us, because men like him filled empty space if you let them, and I had no intention of giving him that advantage. 30 days, I said finally. That's what I've got. He nodded once, like he already knew. That's right, he said. And after that, the county steps in, auctions it off, clean, simple. He glanced toward the house again, toward the faint movement inside where Margaret stood near the window, watching but not stepping out. Shame, really, he added. Nice piece of land, good bones. Harold shifted beside me, and this time the tremor was harder to hide, his shoulders tightening just enough to show the strain of holding himself steady. I felt it more than saw it, the way age and effort were starting to take their toll, the way this wasn't just about land for him anymore, but about something deeper, something tied to dignity, to survival. We're not leaving, Harold said, his voice firmer now, not louder, but anchored in something that didn't bend easily. Victor looked at him, really looked this time, and for a brief second the smile faded just enough to reveal something underneath. Not anger, not yet, but irritation at a variable he hadn't accounted for. You might not have a choice, he said, his tone still calm, but carrying a weight that wasn't there before. That was when Duke moved. Not fast, not sudden, just a single step forward, his body aligning fully between Victor and the house, his head level, ears forward, a low sound building in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl, just a warning that didn't need to be louder to be understood. Victor's eyes flicked down to him, and for the first time since he arrived, something in his posture changed. Just a fraction, just enough to show that he recognized what he was looking at. Well trained, he said, almost to himself. He doesn't need to be, I replied. That got his attention back on me. No, he said after a moment, that thin smile returning. I suppose not. He took a step back then, adjusting his coat like he had already decided how this would play out, even if the details hadn't settled yet. 30 days, he repeated. We'll see how that goes. He turned without waiting for a response, moving back toward his SUV with the same measured pace he had arrived with, not rushed, not concerned. Like this was just one move in a longer game, he was already confident he would win. The engine started again, the sound breaking the stillness before fading as the vehicle disappeared back down the road. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind picked up again, brushing across the fields, carrying with it the weight of what had just happened. I stood there, watching the empty road, feeling the shift settle into place, not just the threat he represented, but the reality of what we were up against. Harold let out a slow breath beside me, his shoulders dropping slightly as the tension eased just enough to show how much he had been holding back. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I already knew what I would see. Instead, I stepped forward, placing myself directly in front of the house, Duke at my side, his presence steady, unyielding. This time, when I took my position, there was no hesitation, no question. Because whatever came next, I wasn't stepping away from it. Not anymore. Morning unfolded in a thin gold wash over the fields, a quiet mercy after the tension Victor left behind, and I found that the day didn't wait for decisions. It simply offered work and expected hands to meet it. I stepped out before the kettle whistled, breath fogging in the cold, boots sinking into soil that still held last night's frost, and the first thing I noticed was the way the place already had a rhythm that didn't need me, the kind of rhythm you either learn or break, and I had broken enough things for one lifetime. Harold was at the far end of the garden, sleeves rolled despite the chill, fingers moving with a steadiness that didn't match the tremor I had seen the day before. And that contradiction told me more about him than any story could. He had the posture of a man who measured worth in effort, tall once, now slightly bent, but stubborn in the way that made the bend look like a choice rather than surrender. And when he saw me, he didn't stop working, just nodded once, like acknowledging a tool he hadn't decided how to use yet. "Ground's still good," he said, voice roughened by years and weather. "Just needs tending like anything else that's been left too long." I picked up a spare shovel leaning against the fence, the handle worn smooth where hands had gripped it over and over, and stepped in beside him without asking where to start. Because some things don't need instruction if you're willing to learn by doing. We worked in parallel for a while, turning soil, clearing stones. The silence between us not empty but functional, and somewhere in that steady motion, I felt a piece of the tension loosen, not disappear, just settle into something I could carry. Back at the house, the kitchen had come alive with a different kind of work. Margaret seated at the table with a bowl of dough, her movements deliberate, conserving energy without sacrificing care. Her silver hair catching the light as she leaned forward, and Lily stood at the counter, sleeves pushed up, flour dusting her forearms, her posture efficient and grounded, the kind of competence that comes from doing the same small tasks well for a long time. She glanced up when I stepped in, eyes measuring, then softening just enough to acknowledge that I had chosen to stay another morning. "We're trying something simple first," she said, nodding toward the dough. "Bread, maybe pies if we can stretch the ingredients. The town market doesn't need fancy, it needs honest." Margaret smiled at that, a quiet lift at the corner of her mouth, then paused, hand resting lightly against her chest as the breath caught for a second before smoothing out again. Duke rose from his place near the door and moved to her side without prompting, lowering himself so that his shoulder touched the leg of her chair, a small, steady anchor, and I watched it happen with a kind of recognition that felt both reassuring and unsettling, because it confirmed what I had been trying not to say out loud. "He does that when you push too hard," I said, keeping my voice even, not accusatory. Margaret's eyes met mine, and for a moment there was no pretense in them, just a clear, quiet understanding. "Then I suppose I should listen," she said softly, and she did, easing back just enough to let Lily take over the heavier work. By midday, the place had transformed into something I hadn't seen here before. Not just activity, but intention, a shared direction that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. I repaired a section of the porch railing that had been patched twice already, replacing it with a cleaner joint that would hold through winter, then moved on to the barn door that refused to close properly, the kind of small fix that doesn't look like much but changes how a place functions. And with each task, I found my hands remembering a different kind of training, one that had nothing to do with conflict and everything to do with building something that might last. Lily joined me outside in the early afternoon, wiping her hands on a cloth, her braid loosened further now, strands escaping to frame a face that held both fatigue and resolve. She stood beside me for a moment, watching the way I adjusted the hinge, then nodded slightly. "You've done this before," she said, not surprised, just confirming. "Different kind of work," I answered, tightening the last bolt. "Still work," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that bridged a gap I hadn't known how to cross, a recognition that effort, no matter where it came from, could be redirected into something better. We walked back toward the house together, not rushing, not filling the space with unnecessary words, and when she spoke again, it wasn't a question, not really. "You don't have to carry all of it alone," she said, eyes on the ground ahead, voice steady, not soft, not hard, just certain. I let the words settle, felt the old instinct rise to deflect, to turn it into something lighter or less personal, and for once, I didn't follow it. "I know," I said, and that was enough. Not a confession, not a promise, just a step in the right direction. By late afternoon, we had something to show for it. A small table set up near the road with a handful of loaves, a few jars of preserves Lily had brought from town, and a sign Harold had painted in careful, uneven letters that read simply, "Fresh bread." It wasn't much, but it was a start, and starts mattered more than scale when time was measured in days instead of years. A pickup slowed as it passed. An older man at the wheel, weathered face, white beard trimmed close, eyes that carried the kind of quiet curiosity that didn't intrude but didn't ignore either. He pulled over, stepped out, and introduced himself as Tom Berenger, a local rancher who had lived in the area long enough to remember when this place still belonged to my parents. He was broad-shouldered, thick hands marked by years of labor, his stance relaxed but grounded, the kind of man who didn't trust easily but respected effort when he saw it. "Didn't think I'd see life back here," he said, picking up a loaf, weighing it in his hand like he was measuring more than just bread. "We're working on it," Harold replied, and there was a quiet pride in his voice that hadn't been there before. Tom nodded, set a few bills on the table without bargaining, and glanced at me. "You the one who came back?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. He studied me for a second, then gave a small, approving nod. "Took you long enough," he said, not unkindly, then climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving behind a simple transaction that felt bigger than it should have. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, we gathered what we had left and brought it inside, the air cooler now, the work of the day settling into a quiet satisfaction that I hadn't expected to feel so soon. Margaret sat near the window, Duke at her feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert, and Harold leaned against the doorframe, watching the light fade with a look that suggested he was measuring something deeper than the day's progress. Lily moved between us, collecting plates, her presence steady, unforced, and I realized I had started to look for her in the spaces where I used to expect nothing at all. I stepped outside one last time, drawn by the quiet, by the way the land held the last of the day's warmth, and I found Duke in the center of the yard, stretched out on the grass, completely at ease in a way I hadn't seen in years. He lifted his head when I approached, met my eyes, then settled again without moving, like he didn't need to check whether I was staying. I stood there for a long moment, hands at my sides, the weight of the past still present but no longer the only thing I could feel. And it came to me without resistance, without argument, just a simple, undeniable truth. I didn't want to leave. The night turned colder than it had any right to be for that time of year, a thin, needling cold that slipped through the smallest cracks and made itself known in quiet, persistent ways. And I woke before dawn with that same feeling I used to get before things went wrong, a pressure in the chest that didn't come from fear, so much as from knowing something had already shifted, and I was just late to it. Duke was on his feet before I moved, head angled toward the back of the house, his body alert in a way that had nothing to do with passing sounds, and when I stepped outside, the air hit sharper, cleaner, carrying with it a wrongness that didn't belong to weather alone. The pump handle near the well sat at an angle I hadn't left it, the metal casing scratched in fresh lines that cut through the frost, and when I tried it, the resistance told me what my eyes already had. Something had been tampered with, not broken outright, just enough to stop it from doing what it was meant to do. "Harold," I called, keeping my voice low but firm. He was there within seconds, coat half-buttoned, breath already uneven from the cold, and I saw it again, the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for the pump, the way his shoulders tightened when it didn't respond. "Damn it," he muttered. Not loud, not angry, just tired in a way that spoke of knowing exactly what this meant. "We can fix it," I said, already moving to inspect the base. The bolts loosened just enough to shift the alignment, the kind of damage that didn't take long to do but cost time we didn't have to repair. "Yeah," he answered, but there was a delay in it, a fraction of a second where doubt had slipped in before he pushed it back out. Inside, Margaret had set the kettle out of habit, then stopped when she realized there was no water to fill it, her hand resting against the counter longer than necessary, and Lily moved to her side without needing to be asked, her expression tightening as she took in the situation, the calculation in her eyes already moving through the day ahead. "We can haul from the creek," she said. "Practical, immediate, not ideal, but it'll keep us going." I nodded because it was the only answer that mattered right now. Not ideal, but enough. We worked through the morning with a kind of focused quiet, the kind that comes when there's no room for panic because there's too much to do. Harold and I resetting the pump as best we could, tightening what had been loosened, realigning what had been shifted, while Lily organized what remained inside, rationing without making it feel like loss. By midday, the pump gave a weak response, not full pressure, but a start. A thin stream that sputtered before steadying, and it was enough to keep things moving, enough to remind us that not everything had been taken, just enough to make us work harder for what remained. The market that afternoon didn't go the way it had the day before. The bread slightly overdone from a fire that had burned hotter than intended. The jars fewer, the table quieter, and yet people still stopped, still bought what they could, not out of charity, but because the work was honest, and that mattered here more than perfection. It was on the way back that we found the second sign. A crate we had left near the road overturned, the contents scattered. A few jars broken cleanly as if placed down and struck rather than dropped, deliberate, controlled, the kind of damage meant to send a message rather than cause chaos. Harold didn't say anything when he saw it, just crouched down slowly, gathering what could be saved, his movements careful despite the tremor that had grown more noticeable as the day wore on. I watched him for a moment, the way he carried himself through it, not defeated, not surprised, just continuing, and something in that steadiness anchored the rest of us without needing to be spoken. "We keep going," Lily said quietly, more to Margaret than anyone else, and Margaret nodded, though the effort it took showed more clearly now, her breathing shorter, her steps slower, the small pauses no longer as easy to hide. That night, the house felt tighter, not from fear, but from the weight of everything pressing in at once, and when Margaret's hand slipped from the table as she stood, her body following it in a slow, unsteady motion that ended against the edge of the chair, the moment stretched just long enough to turn concern into urgency. Lily was beside her immediately, fingers at her wrist, eyes sharp and focused in a way that left no room for hesitation. "We're not waiting on this," she said, her voice cutting through the room with quiet authority. "Ethan, get the truck." The drive into town blurred in a way that had nothing to do with speed, the road a narrow strip of focus between what had happened and what might. And Duke stayed in the back, silent, his presence steady even as the tension filled the cab. Margaret didn't speak much, her hand resting in mine where Lily had placed it, her grip lighter than it should have been, but still there, still holding on. The hospital sat at the edge of town, a low building with too much light and not enough warmth, and we moved through it quickly, Lily taking the lead with a confidence that came from knowing the system from the inside. The doctor who met us was a man in his 50s, Dr. Alan Reeves, broad-shouldered with thinning hair and tired eyes that carried more compassion than he tried to show, his movements efficient, practiced, the kind that came from years of seeing too much and still choosing to care. "We'll take it from here," he said, already guiding Margaret toward a room, his tone steady, leaving no room for argument. The hours that followed stretched in a way that made time feel less like something you moved through and more like something you endured, the waiting room quiet except for the occasional shift of a chair or the distant echo of footsteps. And I stayed there, not because anyone asked me to, but because leaving wasn't an option I recognized anymore. Lily sat across from me for a while, then stepped away to speak with the staff, leaving me alone with the weight of it. And when the nurse finally came to tell me I could go in, I didn't hesitate. Margaret lay against the white sheets, smaller somehow, the lines of her face softened by exhaustion, and when her eyes opened, they found mine immediately, like she had expected me to be there. I moved closer without thinking, taking her hand, and this time she didn't hide the effort it took to hold on. "You came back for more than the house, didn't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. I felt the words settle into me, not as a question, but as a truth I'd been circling without naming, and for once I didn't try to answer it, didn't try to turn it into something easier to carry. I just stood there, holding her hand, knowing she was right. The morning the deadline came felt different from the others, not louder, not brighter, just sharper, as if every sound and every breath had been given a clearer edge, and I woke before the light fully settled across the land, already aware of the weight that day carried without needing to name it. The hospital hallway still clung to me in a way that didn't fade with distance. Margaret's hand in mine, her words resting somewhere deeper than thought, and when I stepped outside, the air felt colder than it had any right to be, like it was testing whether I meant what I had yet to say out loud. Duke moved beside me without hesitation, his shoulder brushing my leg in that quiet, grounding way he had, and together we walked the perimeter of the property, not because anything had changed overnight, but because it mattered that we saw it, that we acknowledged it as something still ours to protect. The pump held steady now. The repairs from days before strengthened overnight by effort and necessity. The fence line reinforced in places where weakness had been found, and for the first time since Victor had driven onto the land, the place didn't feel like it was waiting to be taken. It felt like it was holding. Lily met me at the edge of the porch, her hair pulled back tighter than usual, the loose strands gone, her expression carrying the same focus I had seen in the hospital, the kind that didn't allow space for doubt when something needed to be done. "They're finishing up the paperwork in town," she said, her voice steady, but I could hear the tension beneath it, the awareness that until it was done, nothing was certain. "We should go," I replied, and she nodded without hesitation. The drive into town was quieter than before, not empty, but full in a way that didn't need words, and when we arrived, the county office stood exactly as it had in my memory, a low building with aging brick and windows that reflected more sky than substance, the kind of place where decisions were made without emotion and carried out without hesitation. Inside, the air was warmer but no more forgiving, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence, and behind the counter stood a woman in her late 50s, Carol Jensen, her short, gray hair neatly styled, glasses resting low on her nose, her posture straight with the kind of professionalism that came from years of working within rules that didn't bend easily. She looked up as we approached, her eyes moving from me to Lily, then back again, and something in her expression shifted, not recognition exactly, but understanding. "You're cutting it close," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "I know," I answered, placing the envelope on the counter, the weight of it heavier than the contents alone. She opened it carefully, her fingers moving with practiced precision, counting, verifying, her silence stretching just long enough to make the moment feel longer than it was, and I found myself watching her hands more than her face, because they held the answer before she spoke it. When she finally looked up, there was a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough. "It's covered," she said. "All of it." The words didn't hit all at once. They settled, piece by piece, like something I had been holding back finally finding a place to land, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been carrying. Lily's hand brushed lightly against my arm, not a gesture that demanded attention, just one that shared the moment. And for the first time since this had begun, the weight shifted into something else, something lighter, something that felt dangerously close to relief. The drive back felt shorter, though the road hadn't changed, and when the house came into view, I saw them before we even stopped. Harold, standing near the gate, his posture straighter than it had been in days, and Margaret beside him, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her face pale but steady, her eyes fixed on us with a kind of quiet anticipation that didn't need to be spoken. I stepped out of the truck slowly, not because I needed time, but because the moment deserved it. And when I reached them, I didn't start with words. I just nodded once, letting the answer carry through the gesture. Harold's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension easing in a way that revealed how much he had been holding, and Margaret's hand moved to her chest again, not from strain this time, but from something closer to relief. "We're still here," she said softly. "Yeah," I answered, my voice steadier than I felt. "We are." The rest of the day moved without urgency, not because there was nothing left to do, but because for the first time we weren't racing against something we couldn't control, and we let that settle in the only way that made sense, by continuing what we had started, not out of necessity, but out of choice. I found Harold near the barn later that afternoon, his hands resting on the wood, his gaze moving across the land in a way that suggested he was seeing it differently now, not as something temporary, but as something that might last. "You didn't have to do it," he said without turning. "Yeah," I replied, "I did." He nodded once, accepting it without argument, because some truths don't need to be explained to be understood. Margaret sat on the porch when I came back, Duke already at her feet, his head resting against her ankle, and she reached down to brush her fingers through his fur in a slow, absent motion that spoke of comfort more than thought. I stepped up beside her, leaning lightly against the post, the wood solid under my hand, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the quiet between us filled with everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. "You should stay," I said, finally, the words coming out simpler than I had expected, but no less certain. She looked up at me, her expression searching, not for meaning, but for truth. "We would only if it's right," she said. "It is," I answered, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Not because you need it, because I do." That seemed to settle it in a way nothing else could have, and she nodded slowly, the decision forming not just in her, but in all of us. The sun dipped lower as the day eased into evening, casting a warm, steady light across the porch, and we gathered there without planning it, Harold leaning back in his chair, Margaret wrapped in her blanket, Lily sitting beside me, close enough to feel, not close enough to overwhelm, and Duke stretched out at my feet, his presence as constant as the land itself. I looked out across the fields, the same land I had once run from, the same house I had left behind, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something I had lost and regained. It felt like something I had finally understood. I had thought I came back to reclaim what was mine. The truth was, I came back to find what I never had, a place to belong, and this time I wasn't leaving it behind. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive like thunder, loud and undeniable, but more often they come quietly, like a door opening when you thought every path was closed, like a stranger becoming family, like a place you once ran from becoming the place that finally heals you. God does not always change our circumstances overnight, but He changes the people around us, the strength within us, and the courage to stay when leaving would be easier. In everyday life, miracles look like small chances, second beginnings, and the simple decision to choose love over fear. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment about a moment when life surprised you with kindness, and subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. May God watch over you, protect your home, bring peace to your heart, and guide you to the place where you truly belong.